Today is March the 11th. How much can a little white lie hurt? Let's find out together as we study the middle of Jesus' ministry. Today, as we read through the Bible in a year, I'd like you to read Matthew chapter 15 from verse 21 to chapter 16, verse 12. And you'll find a parallel to that passage in Mark chapter 7, verse 24 to chapter 8, 26. There are 6 paragraphs in the passages that I ask you to read. We begin with the story of a Syrophoenician woman. She came to Jesus with a daughter who was possessed by an evil spirit. She presented her to Jesus, and Jesus said, "I've only come for the children of Israel." She responds by saying, "But even the dogs lap up breadcrumbs from the table." Jesus, moved by her faith, heals her daughter. Then we have a deaf mute. There's a man who is deaf and mute. Jesus touches his ears, touches his tongue, gives him back hearing and speech. Jesus feeds 4,000 just like he did when he fed 5,000. Just like when he fed 5,000, he went to the disciples and said, "You feed them." And the disciples again said, "We can't." So Jesus again fed them with far too little food. It had to have been a miracle. Immediately after this, the Pharisees ask for a sign. Now, Jesus has just fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves and a few fish. And the Pharisees, verse 11, when they heard that Jesus had arrived, they came to him and started to argue with him, testing him. They demanded that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. Well, gee whiz, how about feeding 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread and a few fish? But the Pharisees had decided that they would not accept any sign that he gave them. So in asking for a sign, they weren't really asking to believe. They were just trying to put Jesus in an awkward space. When they finished, Jesus said, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod." Now the disciples are confused. They don't know what Jesus is talking about. They look at each other and they realize that they only have 1 loaf of bread. And so they thought, well, maybe he's talking about going to buy bread. And he's saying we shouldn't buy bread from any of the Pharisees' followers or any of Herod's followers. Jesus, when he hears that, he's just amazed. He says in verse 18, "You have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up?" They said 12. When I fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many large baskets of leftovers did you pick up? And they said 7. 7 loaves fed 4,000. 5 loaves fed 5,000. They had 1 loaf of bread in the boat. Wasn't that enough? 1 loaf plus Jesus apparently would have been enough to feed everybody in the boat. He said, "Don't you understand yet?" The leaven of the Pharisees. The disciples didn't understand what that was. It's the book of Matthew that makes this point. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 12, at last they understood that he wasn't speaking about the yeast in bread, but about the deceptive teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You see, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were telling lies about Jesus. They said that he did his miracles through the power of Satan. They said, in addition, right here, that he had not shown them enough signs. They wanted just one more. The leaven of the Pharisees were the little lies that they were telling about Jesus. How hurtful can a little white lie be? Well, sometimes it's not very hurtful, but sometimes a little lie goes a long way. Jesus says, beware of the little lies that we tell each other. They can really hurt us in the end. In the book of Mark, we end with one final story. Jesus heals a blind man. And it looks like he gives the disciples an object lesson here. They're not quite catching what Jesus is saying about the leaven. So he goes to the blind man. Blind man asks to be healed. Jesus heals him. And then for the first time in his ministry, he asks, how'd I do? Can you see? And the man says, well, I see men, but they don't look right. They look like trees walking around. Jesus touches the man again, and he said, okay, now I see. Why in the world would he do that? He had the power to heal him the first time. Why didn't he do that then? I think this was an object lesson for the disciples. You're just like the blind man. You see, but you don't see clearly. You need a touch from Jesus that helps you to see clearly. We need to be careful with the little lies that we tell each other. Let's speak the truth to each other in love. Please like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Email your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. We'll see you in church on Sunday.